Hey everyone, welcome back to Console. In this week's episode, we'll be looking at a blog post by Farid Zakaria titled Containers from First Principles. Containers are obviously the new hotness in IT right now. Everyone's talking about containers and all their possibilities, so it's obvious that I'm going to do an episode on containers myself. What I liked about this post though is it wasn't too long, and you'll see that this console episode is actually shorter than the previous ones. But there's still a lot of good content in it. It's concise, short, it's relatively simple, so it's kind of easy to follow along, and it gets you like the core of what a container is, namely the namespaces. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Okay, here's the blog post, Farid's blog post. And basically what we're going to do, as I already said, is we're going to take this very basic Linux distro and we're going to blow it up into its own container running on my Pi. So in previous videos I had been using a Ubuntu container. For this particular one I found it to be a little too constraining, and so I was like, okay, I'm just going to set my Pi up, and probably I'll end up using my Pi in future videos. It's kind of a pain because it's running Raspbian or some flavor. I can't remember. I set it up like years ago, so it's a little bit hard to do, but ignore the botnet directory for now. But yeah. So what we're gonna do is what I'm doing is I'm pulling down this tar file, and then we're printing out what's in this tar file after we've done the Docker pull to see like what is actually in a Docker container when you do a Docker pull here. And he explains like what each of these files are and kind of what they do. He doesn't go into a lot of details, which I'm actually kind of happy about that, because sometimes the container stuff can get into a little too deep, right? So you're not learning as much. At the bottom of this particular post, though, he links to a bunch of really good resources, and I think I'm going to keep going on this container direction, I think, because those other posts are super interesting as well. In fact, one of them I kind of wish I would have covered that rather than this post, because this one's a little shorter and a little less in depth than the other one. But anyway, this one's still good too. So we're just following the instructions at this point, where I'm just untarring the files basically. So at this point what he's pointing out is like, what is a container exactly? And he's saying like, you have to have these three resources isolated, and the way you do isolation in Linux is namespaces. So he's just saying like, we're going to set up these namespaces, or we're going to kind of isolate this tar that we've created previously, so that those three resources are completely isolated from the rest of the Raspberry Pi that I'm using. You can see here I'm Googling like Linux namespaces, because I had was kind of familiar with them, but I didn't know any of the details. I just knew I knew containers and namespaces go hand in hand, but I didn't know any of the details. So this blog post is really useful because I spent time going and figuring out, what exactly is a namespace. So at this point, he basically spins up his own Google Cloud instance. I'm using a Pi, and then he installs Docker. So that's what we're doing here. If you don't already have Docker installed on your machine that you're going to be running this tutorial on, then you have to go do that. I'm doing that here in my case. So what we're doing here is we're taking that untarred Docker container and we're putting it in its own directory. Simple as that. So now we've got it in its own directory, and this is where you actually break the container into its own namespace effectively, right? That's what this unshare command does. In this case, the fork command is typical Linux thing where it's going to fork it into its own process, and -mount means you're going to get your own mount namespace. After that, we're just mounting because we need to be able to mount the container directory in order to run pivot root, and pivot root's just switching me to that new root basically. So now the root is going to be /container rather than previously it was /root in the old namespace. We're in this new namespace now, and now the root is going to be container, and the root of that is going to be _old. You can see here I ran into a couple of problems because he doesn't mention that you have to actually have that directory old. At least on my flavor of Linux, I had to have that in order to run the pivot root. So I was going, what's going on? Why isn't this working? And finally figured out, I just need to go create that directory old so that I can have that new root. So after getting the pivot root, switching the root, basically what you need to do is you need to unmount that that file system that you'd created previously that was mapped to the old, and that at that point now your container is like completely isolated from the rest of the system from a mount perspective, right? What he gets into later in the article is he says like, well, you're still not completely isolated. You think you might be isolated, and that's because you only passed -- mount to unshare, right? So your mount points are in separate namespaces, but your processes aren't, and various other resources, which, like he says before at the beginning of the blog post, there's 3 that you really need to be isolated in order to be considered a quote-unquote container. In this case, all we've done is isolated the mount points, which, I mean, that was one thing I didn't really like about this particular blog post is you run the same commands like 3 different times. I mean, it's useful that he's showing you like, hey, you need to pass all these flags at once, like in order to completely isolate yourself, and here's why. But it was kind of confusing for somebody who doesn't deal with containers that often to like, you kind of have to know where he's heading when he's explaining all this stuff. And I didn't particularly know where he was heading until I got to the very end, and like he was like, oh, look, you haven't isolated these other resources, and here's why you need to pass these extra flags. But while I was following the tutorial, I didn't get that until the very, very end, which to me is like not a great sign of a great tutorial. So, I mean, here's where the light bulb finally comes on, right? I was like, oh, I see where he's heading now, right? Once you mount the proc directory, and then psaux on that, you realize like, oh, all these processes are still running. I can still see those processes even though I should be running in a container, right? I can still see all my root processes. So you're not totally isolated. You're isolated again from the mount perspective, but not from the process perspective, right? And so he's like, oh, okay. And then he goes on to explain like, here's why, and here's how you fix that. And then, here we are running. Okay, now rerun unshare again, and last time you passed mount, this time pass PID as well, and then, we'll do the same steps again, and we'll this time mount the proc directory and see, okay, look, we're only printing out these 2 processes rather than all the other ones that were associated with the container previously. Like I said, it was kind of confusing until I got to that point and realized where he was going with the tutorial, right? But even still, you're like running the same commands 3 times again that you had already ran before. Okay, at this point, now he's going to do the same thing he did with the processes when you first ran unshare with only the mount. Now he's going to show you, look, you're still not isolated from the network perspective, right? So how do I fix that? And then he goes on and shows you how to fix that, right? With running the next unshare command. You can see it below, right? The --UTA and --net, right? That puts you in yet another level of isolation from the namespace perspective at both the network perspective and the UTA perspective. So now this time, now that we've isolated ourselves like even further, right, at the process ID or at the process level, at the mount level, and now at the network level, right, what we're going to do is we're going through and setting up our container. And testing that it can actually still get out to the network. So at the very bottom of the tutorial, you're able to ping the 8.8.8.8 IP address after setting up all these interfaces, even though it should be, it is completely isolated from the rest of your operating system from a network perspective. You're still able to go out and hit the internet by the end of the tutorial. And here we are pinging 8.8.8 and getting the responses back from the Google domain. Google IP address. So this is where he's pointing out these other links, right, which I said were super useful, particularly number 1. Number 1's got this same content with much more detail. So I might do that one in the future. I wish I would have known about that blog post rather than this one, because I think that one would have been even more useful. But there's also another one, I think number 2, that's I probably will end up doing in the future, because that one's also super interesting as well. Alright, that's everything for this episode of Console. This one was a super interesting one for me. I think containers are always going to be interesting, or at least they're going to be interesting until they become standard practice, which I don't think has happened yet. So there will be a future, I think, where everyone's using containers and they're like no big deal. But right now we're still in this transition period. I think they're still getting adoption, which is surprising, right? When I was reading through the namespaces wiki page, they'd been introduced like back in the early 2000s, I believe. So they've been around for a long time, but tech just takes a long time for it to gain adoption. But anyway, again, it's still interesting to know the details of containers, right? As a user of containers, that's what I am. I'm a user. I don't know any of the details. I just know, like, when I spin up a Docker instance, it does what I want it to do, right? So this episode was really useful for me to learn about namespaces, to go read the man pages, to learn, like how isolation occurs at the namespace level and things like that. And then also the unshare command. Like I said, as a user of containers, you're not really aware of like what's going on at the kernel level, so it was good to learn about unshare and like the various different levels of isolation you can give using the unshare command. So anyway, like I said, that's everything for this week. Until next time.